And you mentioned the other two, Chogyam, Trungpa, and Osho, and it was just interesting when you brought those three up. I'm like, I know less about Adida, but I know he was also controversial, maybe less controversial than Chogyam and Osho. But it's funny how like the three main, uh, Eastern main like Western spirituality teachers just had so much controversy around them. I think it kind of speaks to how the guru model is just something about it. It always like creates bad dynamics. Even it's not necessarily like the teacher's fault. It's just something about that model that seems to, you know, produce bad outcomes a lot of times. And perhaps there's good outcomes too, because it seems like you've had good experiences living in his community. But I think it's just interesting how those are like the three
Well,
figures.
I think there's something interesting about the whole risk versus reward in spirituality, and how, like in finance, these two are somewhat related to each other. Namely, a riskless spirituality is also going to be maybe have very little reward. And in the existential sense, an example of a riskless spirituality might be the most anodyne version of pop New Age philosophy.
Yeah.
And a high reward one is likely to be high risk. Now, you can talk about what's called the efficient horizon, meaning you might say, here's a spiritual practice. Is there anything that has less risk for this amount of reward? Because you could have two things that have the same amount of reward, and one of them has a much higher risk. Well, obviously, the one with the same reward, the one with less risk is better. But you can't, if you actually, instead of saying what's the least risk I can take for this amount of reward, instead you say how can I get risk down to zero? Well, in doing that, you're going to get your reward shrunken also. And I think that's very true in spiritual life. And in the 70s, there was a higher tolerance for risk, which led to more people getting, I'll call it, big spiritual happenings. The risk also meant there was a greater number of people who had highly adverse effects and led to calls for removing them. This has led to safer spirituality, but also generally less potent spirituality in our current age. And unfortunately, these two cannot be completely delinked.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. What do you feel like? Like, is it the fact that there's like this surrender and this ability to maybe let go of your autonomy somehow? Is because it seems in evolving ground that's a big thing. We talk about autonomy, but it seems like there's the risk is about like releasing the autonomy or like releasing your own ego in some regard.
Well, in that particular model, when it's working right, what's going to happen is that a person is going to be put up against their edge. Now, whether that means in any given case can differ, but it's being up against your edge will often be unpleasant. And if it doesn't work out well, then there can be resentment if you don't fully follow through. And let me try to make that more concrete. And let me try to make it saying that, let me actually try to make up an example that doesn't use sex or drugs like that. Let's say someone is a chillaxed hippie type. The teacher says, you know what? The guru says, wear a suit, get a corporate job. So, you need, that's your path. And they do that. And they do it for a while, and after 3 years, they feel empty and hollow, and they just flame out and say, "Fuck it, man! I just want to be a bicycle repairman." So, the guru cannot, even they cannot foresee the future. Though I'm saying that from an objective sense, because in many traditions it is thought they can. but honestly, that was a reasonable piece of advice for that person to further their spiritual development, to give them a sort of foundation of discipline and social capabilities, and it didn't work out. and 3 years went by, and now you might say the person may feel 3 years of their life was wasted. So the thing is, if you've ever interacted with a doctor or an accountant, you know that even an expert is not always right. I think a lot of people have that with medical care, where people who are actually quite authentically caring doctors who are very high skilled still can make wrong calls. So, and then the question becomes a malpractice lawsuit, and the court decides whether this was intentional malfeasance or not. And honestly, in some sense, a guru, the best at its best, a guru might be like a wise and skilled doctor. They may have an intervention, but like their intervention may actually work for a lot of people, but it may actually disastrously fail occasionally. And then the question is, and then, in the court of public opinion, there's a malpractice lawsuit, so to speak, whether this guru did malpractice or not. And of course, in medicine, a lot of malpractice does happen. So with gurus, a lot of malpractice does happen, but not all adverse outcomes are malpractice.
Yeah, I think also like sometimes the problem is like when you take the teachings and just apply it to every area of your life, and take like the guru's advice and apply it to every area of your life. And it's like, it doesn't necessarily cross over to every area. And like they might have a specialty in this particular area and see where you're caught up in a certain pattern, but it doesn't mean that they can, tell you what to do in every area of your life.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And there's a lot of cultural baggage in the guru model, which is slightly different than expert model, because imagine if doctors were culturally considered to be always right, never wrong. And probably this is so in some cultures.
I think it was for a while.
If you didn't follow the directions exactly, precisely, what the fuck's wrong with you? If you push back, what the fuck's wrong with you? So these are not necessarily not intrinsic to you can imagine a evolved guru model that does include this authoritarianism, but culturally, the guru model often has this sort of problematic authoritarianism baked in.